Now available in paperback and e-readers, The Legendary Mad Matilda. Get the conclusion to the Spinsterella trilogy at online booksellers today. Comic book sales are at an all-time low. And one of the reasons why comic book sales are at an all-time low is due to all the numerous reboots that have transpired over the last 20 years. Now, when it comes down to selling comics, you have to understand how serialized storytelling works. And in serialized storytelling, the issue in a person's hands sells the next issue and it sells the back issues on the backlist. And when it comes down to comic books, when you have a reboot, what happens is you wind up short circuiting your ability to build momentum. So the comic book in somebody's hands does not allow them to move towards the backlist if they're moving backwards, nor does it give them incentive to move forward to the next issue. When it comes down to selling comics, you really have to understand the power of momentum in moving sales. And when you have a comic book, you need to have momentum because each issue that a person buys either sells the next issue for next month, which is the new title, or it gives people incentive to go into the backlist to go buy more titles. And if you cannot build momentum for a book, that book is not going to be able to generate sales. And what's been happening at most comic book companies is that whenever there is a creative team change or an editorial problem like there was at Marvel during 2001 when several creative teams left and editorial really didn't know what to do to replace those teams, and then we got Joe Quesada. What happened was we had the momentum stop as they canceled series and then started over. And every time they would cancel a series, what would happen is all the readers who would build momentum would wind up stopping, and then what happened after that was people started to get frustrated. And as people started to get frustrated, they stopped collecting comics because they got tired of starting a series, starting to build that momentum, starting to get into this character, and then having the series end abruptly. It really frustrates people when they just start picking up a character's adventures, and as they're reading the story, they soon find out that by the 36th issue or the 24th issue, or in some cases the 8th issue, the series is over. And then after that series is over, they find out, oh, this series is relaunching yet again, and that prevents the series from really building that momentum that old school comics used to do. Now, old school comics, when they had those big numbers of 200, 300, 400, that was something that allowed that series to build momentum. And that momentum drove the readers forward and it also drove the readers backwards. So that momentum is what allowed those series to generate sales, and it allowed it to not only maintain its audience with older readers, but allowed it to build an audience with new readers. Unfortunately, many of today's comic book editors are so caught up in trying to fix mistakes of the past or fix mistakes related to continuity or deal with a corner that they've painted themselves into creatively that they decide to end a series and reboot it, and then what happens is they wind up losing all the momentum they had, and then they wind up losing the audience because the audience has nothing to drive them forward, and that kills the long-term sales for most of these comics, and that's why comics are struggling to sell right now, because just as a reader gets into a book, what happens is they decide they want to cancel the book, and then you're stuck there and the book can't generate any momentum because if a reader has to start all over again, that prevents them from having incentive to keep buying the book. And then when you have constant reboots like Marvel has had over the last couple of years, what happens is people start to get really, really frustrated because just as they're just about to get into a story, or just as they start to try to recommend characters to other friends and family, they can't do that because the book is constantly rebooting, and that really kills also your word of mouth. And word of mouth is primarily how a series gets sold. When you're doing serialized storytelling or trade publishing, you really want to build strong word of mouth, and it's hard for a comic to build word of mouth when you have a series that constantly is getting canceled and rebooted. New readers just don't know when to start because the series is either getting canceled and they have to find out which volume is which or what part of the continuity is what. And that is really frustrating for a new customer. When you have one straight volume and you could have numerous revamps like they did with Giant Size X-Men and X-Men 94 or with Neil Adams' Green Arrow, people will figure stuff out and then they will just figure out whether if they want to go read the older adventures or if they just want to just move forward with this character in their new adventures. However, if you have numerous reboots like we've had at Marvel and with DC with the New 52 and the Rebirth, it becomes downright frustrating for both older readers and younger readers, and it knocks out that momentum. And I've seen this as related to the comic book industry, and one of the reasons why many books are struggling with sales is that most editors just don't understand the concept of momentum and how momentum can drive your sales. And they don't understand that when every time you do one of these reboots, you are cutting off your sales and you're winding up tripping yourself up, and you're not going to be able to build that momentum to keep the readers moving forward. What you're doing is you're slowing the reader's momentum down, and when you slow the reader's momentum down, that's going to make them stop. And you do not want to make a reader stop when you're doing serialized storytelling. When you write serialized storytelling, you really want the readers to just keep moving, because as long as they keep moving, they're going to keep buying comics. But if they stop, they will stop buying comics, and if they stop buying comics, that eventually leads to you winding up with lower sales and lower sales numbers. So a lot of today's comic creators, they're not really thinking about it from a business perspective. They're thinking, oh, I'll do this reboot, I'll get this big number one, and they're not thinking about selling the issues after that. A smart publisher will sit there and think about selling the comics after the number one, because the number one, yes, that's going to get big numbers, but you have to think about selling the series, because again, that number one that's in their hands is supposed to motivate them to buy number two. Number two is supposed to motivate people to buy number three and number one. So that second issue is very important, because that's the one that's going to drive people backwards, and it's also going to drive people forward. So you have to understand how the momentum works, and after that you have to have the series selling with those books that are in people's hands, because it's those books that are in people's hands that move the series. And if you don't understand how to sell a series, you're not going to be able to sell comics. And when I look at many comic publishers these days, they just don't know how to sell, and they don't know how to use momentum to their advantage towards moving those sales, because momentum is a powerful force in moving sales, and that's what's going to drive your word of mouth, and it's also going to drive customers to the store for the new issues and also for the back issues. Smart editors know how to move people with momentum, and they know that once you get people to start buying something, you have to keep them buying it, and you really don't want them to stop, because once people put a period at the end of a story, that means you're not going to be able to get sales for future books. And this is something many comic publishers really need to start taking a more critical look at, because with each of these reboots, what you're doing is causing the reader to put a period at the end of things, and then they're not moving forward with your products, not moving forward with your brand, and you're not moving towards buying the next product. This is something that they really need to start thinking about, because as I see it, we really need to stop with the reboots in comics, because every reboot leads to lower sales. It'll lead to a short spike in a number one, but then it leads to decline later on. And that decline, again, is due to these books not being able to build up that strong momentum that old school comics used to be able to build back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, because they had those large numbers. And because they had the large numbers, you could move backwards in the back list, or you can move forward towards the front list. And that's really something most people really need to think about, because if you can't build momentum in the comic book business, then you're not going to be able to sell comics in large numbers and get to those sales numbers where you're at the 80, 90, or 100,000 level, because that in order to build towards that type of sales number, you really have to build that momentum, you really have to build that energy, and you have to build up a series of stories that in the levels of 20 issues, 30 issues, or 40 issues, where people have enough kinetic backstory to propel the series ahead. And that's something that can't be done when you're rebooting every 36 issues to 24 issues or even 8 issues. And when you're rebooting like that, it shows that there's a real serious problem in the editorial department. And when you have problems in the editorial department, then you don't know how to set a direction towards building the momentum that will help you lead to stronger sales. If you want to try some of my ISIS series books or my E-Steam series books, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com. And if you want to donate to my Patreon to help me pay for the 2018 SJS Direct catalogs covers, you may do so by clicking the link to my Patreon. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.